Hello, everyone. I'm starting just a couple minutes early. I just want to get everything set up for the captions, so we're just testing this out. Kim is my lovely captioner who is here with me today, and she'll be captioning everything that I'm saying during the reading. I will also post a PDF of the section that I'm reading tonight on my website at amandaleduc.com. And you'll be able to reference that afterwards if you missed anything during the course of the session. For now, we're just going to hang out for a couple of minutes. I can see out of the corner of my eye that the captions appear to be working just fine, which is wonderful. So we'll just wait for another 2 minutes until things start, and then I will read to you all from this wonderful book, Disfigured, on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space by yours truly, Amanda Leduc, published by Coach House Books. 1 minute to go. Don't know why I'm nervous. It's not like I have an audience in front of me in person. You're all virtual. You're all out there in space. Still nervous though. Imagine that. All right, 7 p.m. on the dot. Here we go. Thank you for joining me, everyone, today. My name is Amanda Leduc, and I am a Canadian writer and author of this recently released book, Disfigured, on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space. It's published by Coach House Books, and I'm going to read to you a little bit from the book today. Before I do that, I have some thank yous that I need to put out into the world. Thank you, first of all, to Coach House Books for being such a wonderful publisher, for championing this story right from its very beginning. And thank you to, I have a list that I have to consult, there's a few names, to the National Arts Center, Facebook, Slate Music, Sirius XM, RBC, and the Bennett Family Foundation, all of whom have been huge supporters of the Canada Performs program, which we are all so thankful for in this time of upheaval. So many thanks to all of those for making this possible for me to be here with you today. After I finish my reading, I'm going to do a short Q&A. You'll notice on the right-hand side of your screen, on your YouTube screen, there is a YouTube chat. Feel free to pop any questions that you have in there, and I'll do my best to answer them. I'm thinking the Q&A will probably be about 10 minutes or so. So if you've read the book and you have any burning questions about it, and if you haven't read the book and still have burning questions after the reading is over, please feel free to ask. So just as a way of sort of introducing you to the book, Disfigured is kind of a memoir / cultural criticism look at the way that disability is treated in fairy tales, and how the way that disability is treated in fairy tales has in turn influenced different stories that we tell about disability in the world today. And it's a mix of cultural criticism, but also some memoir. I talk about my own experience as a girl growing into a woman with cerebral palsy. And in the section that I'm going to read to you today, I'm talking about superheroes who are connected to fairy tales and then also their very own thing, because superheroes also have a very particular way that they view the human body. And so the section that I'm going to read from takes place in 7th grade during a particularly difficult time for me. And yes, so I will just start right there. Once, while I was sitting at my desk during lunch period in 5th grade, a student sitting beside me asked if I could reach under my seat to grab her pencil, which had rolled under my chair. "She can't," my red-haired nemesis said behind me. "She'll have to bend over and take the pickle out of her ass first." Pickle. Always that phrase, just because I walked differently, just because, quote, "you walk like you've got a pickle stuck up your ass." The rage that came over me when she said this was immediate and hot, overwhelming. I slammed my chair back into her desk so hard that it tipped her own desk over, pushing her so that the chair she sat on teetered back on its hind legs, wobbly and ready to collapse, exactly the way that I felt. Her laughter was immediate, tinged with surprise and a sliver of terror. I heard the rest of the class laugh too. 27 years later, I can close my eyes and hear that laughter exactly as it sounded on that day so many years ago. I have never wanted to be a superhero or a demon, something other than I was, as much as I did in that moment. To push the chair away from my desk and turn around and send that girl sweeping up through the air and back against the wall, so hard that her skull cracked. To see her face split open upon impact and watch the blood and the brain matter trickle down her cheeks. I wanted to stand over her as she screamed and grind her face into the floor. I wanted to turn an arm back toward the rest of the class who had laughed with her, who had always laughed with her, and do it to them too. I wanted to see them cower, to see them lose themselves in awe. I wanted them to cry and scream and beg for mercy. But I also wanted to be right to withhold that mercy. I wanted my anger to be justified, to make sense, to be understandable, to mete out punishment that was as clear and unbiased as that from a goddess. I wanted them to love me, to be terrified of me, to want to be me. I wanted all of this even though I knew already that in a few years I would go to a different high school and meet other people and move on from this part of my life. I wanted all of this even as I gasped in my rage and pulled my chair back up to its regular position and heard the girl behind me right her own desk and chair, her laugh shaky and hard. I wanted all of this through the rest of that afternoon as I stared at my desk, red-faced and hot. I wanted all of this through the next day and the next, and the day after that one and the week after that, limping through the hallways, limping through my life. I have not stopped wanting all this. Eventually, I moved on to high school. I met other friends, and life was indeed different. I traveled and lived in different cities, and had lovers and felt beautiful, and many of the things that I had wanted came true. I still have not stopped wanting all this, these triumphs, these vindications. I go back and back to that day. I still want them to love me, even though I know it isn't worth it, even though I know, more importantly, that my anger and rage at the unfairness of it all is directly tied to the fairy tale superhero lens through which I was already unconsciously viewing the world. If my world was unfair, surely that meant that things would swing back around eventually. Surely events would put themselves to rights. Surely I would get my happy ending too, even if it took a little while. Because isn't that what happened in all of the stories I was told? Life could be unfair, but the world itself was a fair place. Be good, do good work, and you would either be rewarded or find the strength within yourself to put your world to rights. That's just how it's went. I didn't fantasize back then about the world, what the world might look like if it actually was fair, if there was no need for superheroes at all. I didn't imagine what life might have been like in a world without bullying. I took it for granted that the bullying would come because I walked differently and occupied a different space, and the world that I lived in told me that that was what happened to bodies that were different. It seemed easier to imagine a world where I had magical powers than a world where different bodies just existed together, side by side. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. In an article for NBC's Think on the famous quote from Martin Luther King, a quote that was itself inspired by a sermon by the 19th century clergyman Theodore Parker, writer Chris Hayes notes, "The claim expresses a specific kind of informed optimism, an eyes-wide-open faith in humanity. Obviously there is evil and trial and tragedy, and hatred all around us, and yet good ultimately does prevail. In the same way you can't tell the earth is round as you walk on it, the trajectory of history is imperceptible as we struggle through it, but rest assured its contours are there." But what happens when your eyes have never been wide open in the first place? If you are a disabled person whose life has been one sidelined narrative after another, the disfigured witch or the monster or the dwarf, the ill child as beatific sacrifice, so that her parents might see God and better themselves. Where is the moral arc of your own story? The arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, yes, but sometimes that arc takes a preposterously long time. And in the world that we've built, it's easier for us to imagine that only superheroes, or perhaps fairy godmothers, can bend the arc for us. Everything else just takes too long. What might it have meant to me at 8 years old, at 10, to know deep in my bones that I didn't have anything to prove to the classmates who told me that I walked funny, who sneered at the way that I ambled through class? To understand that I wasn't waiting to become a princess or a superhero, or even waiting for an unconventional rescuer, but instead was not in need of rescuing at all because there was nothing wrong with my body. What does it mean for me now, at 37, to understand that the world still sees my body in this different way? As a disabled woman, I am at once hyper-present and completely invisible. My limp can at times be mild, and so I can sink into the background, an undercover agent in the able-bodied world, which is a kind of superpower in disguise that doesn't feel quite right, although it feels better than those long-ago days at school. My disabled body, bereft of both fairy godmothers and superhero change, is either an object of pity or an object of tender fascination, but rarely something other than that. We are sad Tiny Tims, or we are everyday superheroes, inspiring those who can walk and run just fine with our inhuman strength in completing the impossible ordinary. Shopping in our wheelchairs, walking with our canes, navigating the world with our guide dogs and scooters and other supports, augmentations that aren't sexy, like the claws that come racing out of Wolverine's hands or the arc reactor in Iron Man Tony Stark's chest, or the impossible body that gets to be Steve Rogers, but are nonetheless tools that we use to make ourselves be more. Building a world that either accommodates these tools or makes it so the tools aren't necessary in the first place. Why the need for a body that can fight wars, after all, if you build a world where there are no wars in the first place, is a particular kind of magic, one that still eludes us all. A little over 2 years ago, I walked to work at the hospital where I worked one day and felt, as I battled the wind, the familiar words that pound through my head on a regular basis, in rhythm to my lopsided, hurried gait. You don't walk like everybody else. You don't walk like everybody else. It's not unusual, this refrain. I think it every time I hear my footsteps on the ground. I hear it every time I catch my body passing by a window. And yet, for some reason, that day, something changed. It's not that you don't walk like everybody else, the little voice continued. It was my voice, speaking something I had known all along. It's that no one else in the world walks like you. Why did it take me 35 years to realize this? Something to do with the way we tell stories, something to do with how we understand the body in both its regular variety and in what we perceive as its superhuman form. We are capable, writes the disabled academic Tobin Siebers, of believing at once that the body does not matter and that it should be perfected. And so, we fantasize about eradicating disability in the same way that we fantasize about superheroes and magic, taking it for granted that the different body is different in the same way that superheroes are different, gifts though that different may be, longing for an act through which we will individually restore the world, because systemic overhaul is too grand an undertaking. We are all for subverting stories until the subversion requires a change in the real world that involves work, at which point we fall back into our regular narratives and look to the one who'll come to rescue us. We take it for granted that the world is flawed and in need of a Captain Marvel or Captain America to save it. We take it for granted that the disabled body is a bug in the system and do not, instead, celebrate its difference as a feature. But my walk, my legs, my body, I am, all of me, a feature. We are, all of us, a feature. I have no fairy godmother because I have no need of one. I am not waiting for an unconventional white knight to come crashing up a causeway to my castle because I have seen the castle and its darkest heart, and nothing in it scares me anymore. I have no need of rescue. I want more than the stories that posit the strong as those who survive and protect the rest of us. I want stories where people are not applauded for embracing difference, but instead reshape the world so that difference is the norm. I have nothing to prove to the world because the world has everything to prove to me. It is the world's responsibility to make space for my body, my words, my lopsided gait. Our bodies, our words, our ways of moving through the world. To hold my childhood dreams of being a princess and a superhero close and help me understand that there is no need to want to be either. To start telling different stories about a body that might just look like mine and reshaping the world to fit them. I am already enough. There is no need to be more. So that, again, is from my book, Disfigured, on fairy tales, disability, and making space. It is out now with Coach House Books. Thank you again to the National Arts Centre for promoting this Canada Performs series of events in the wake of the COVID crisis. So lovely to be able to reach everybody through the internet and talk about books and art and music. Disfigured is available for purchase on the Coach House Books website, and I will say that if you purchase the book today, you can get 25% off of the title using the code Canada Performs at checkout. It's also available in a variety of accessible formats, and my great thanks are due to CELA Library, the Centre for Equitable Library Access, and NNELS, the National Network of Equitable Library Services in Canada, both of whom worked together to produce the accessible versions of Disfigured, and I am so grateful to all of them for everything that they did to make these accessible versions of the book come into the world. Now, at this point, we'll do a bit of a Q&A. So if you notice again, at the beginning of my session, I talked about the chat box in YouTube. I was about to say Yahoo. No, in YouTube. If you have any questions about what I read, or if you've read the book already and you have any questions about what was in the book, please feel free to pop a question in the question box, and I will do my best to answer. And we'll hang out probably for another, I'd say maybe 5-10 minutes or so, and I can talk to you guys about what's in the book. So please throw your questions at me. Sarah Leanna, thank you very much, says, what a moving reading. Jadu says, beautiful reading as well. Thank you all. I appreciate that. It's lovely to know that I'm not actually just speaking to my computer, even though I still sort of am. Hello, Michaela. Thank you for coming. Throw me a question, guys. David Alberton says, great reading. Oh, thank you, David. Can you talk about what you learned about fairy tales in the process of writing the book? Yes, I can. So I learned a lot about Western fairy tales in particular. I did some research into different fairy tales that exist in other parts of the world. When I was writing the book, my original plan was to devote a number of different chapters to fairy tales that come from different parts of the world. But as the time went on and my own personal story sort of became more prominent in the book, I didn't have as much space to devote to other fairy tales as I had been hoping for. And then also it didn't really feel right. It didn't feel like those were my stories to share necessarily, because as a girl growing up in a Western country, I was mostly familiar with Western fairy tales. So specifically the Disney versions of many of the Western fairy tales that we know. So the book ended up being focused on those tales in particular. But I learned a lot about the ways in which particularly the non-Disney versions of fairy tales often had a very sort of crucial social aspect to play. The renowned fairy tale scholar Jack Zipes talks a lot about this in his fairy tale scholarship work, where he points out how fairy tales have often been used as kind of countercultural narratives. For example, in France, in the 16th and 17th centuries, women were not allowed to go to the universities. So what they did instead was they would have these literary salons, and they started telling fairy tales, taking them from the folk tales that were sort of told by the illiterate peasant class. So they would take these oral stories and they would retell them in these literary salons. And the whole point of retelling them was to make the language more highfalutin, if you will, to make it more literary. And one of the things that was really interesting was with some of the folk tales in particular, what you would see in France is women who were retelling these stories would take out traditional authority figures like the church or the man of the household, and they would swap those out for fairy godmothers and wise women who would then be the ones that would be dispensing wisdom or dispensing magic or helping a tale come forward to its completion. So there was an interesting sort of subversive nature of fairy tales. The interesting thing for me, though, is that even though there's that subversive heart to many of them, there's also the element where fairy tales are often used as a sort of didactic tale that you tell young children in particular, and they teach children how to behave. So something like Beauty and the Beast, one of the subsequent versions of Beauty and the Beast did that very much so, where the idea in, the beauty going off to marry the beast, and the idea was that he was nice to her so that she should still marry him and be pleased to marry him because his inner part was, his inner soul was beautiful. And the idea there was that young women who were being sent off in arranged marriages to much older, often emotionally distant dukes, who often must have seemed like beasts to these young girls. This was a tale that sort of mollified that for them. So it's a bit tricky, right? They're tales where you can argue against the constrictions and structures of society, but then also once society gets a hold on those tales as well, they can use them to sort of pat people back in line. And I found that really fascinating, and I don't think I'll ever be able to read a fairy tale now without having those kinds of levels going on in my head. Another question. Hi, Irene. Irene, who just said wonderful reading, was someone that I interviewed for the book. So hello, Irene. It's lovely to see you here. Anyone? I can do one or two more questions. There's lots in the book, so please feel free to pick on anything. Okay. Jadu says, could you speak to the process of structuring the book? How you decided what order it would go in and why? Oh, hello, Preeti. Hello. So the book kind of came together organically. I was thinking about it initially as just a piece of cultural criticism. I wanted to focus mainly on fairy tales and the way that they've depicted disability in the past. And then as I was writing it, it just sort of evolved naturally into this kind of hybrid form, because I found that in order to speak to the kind of fairy tale elements of things, which could be quite dry at times, I really needed to balance that with my own personal experience. And one of the things that was neat for me as I just continued to write it was that I realized I was sort of thinking about my own life in terms of a fairy tale, both how I had conceived of myself when I was younger and how I, was sort of reaching for a quote-unquote normal happy ending. And then how that translated into the happy ending that I discovered once I had written the book and had sort of come to terms and really come to recognize and rejoice in my identity as a disabled person. So the book really sort of took on this hybrid, strange form, which felt very organic to me at the time and still feels very organic. And I guess it's kind of like a personal essay writ large. Well, I know what it actually is, and what I've been thinking of it as is it's sort of like a braided personal essay writ large, But because it's writ large in that way, I have often thought about the book as a kind of what I've been calling a fishtail essay, where there are a lot of strands that are braided together. So the braid is maybe a little bit more intricate than the braids that we normally know. So I'm calling it the fishtail form, guys. I have set that down. That's what it is. I could also call it the Leduc, I suppose, but I like fishtail better. I think it has a little more of a ring to it that I really like. So you heard it here first. May 8th, 2020, the fishtail essay form as invented by Amanda Leduc. Preeti, thank you very much for that question. James asks, what's the difference between writing fiction and nonfiction? So I find, much to my surprise, that nonfiction is a little bit easier for me than writing fiction. And I don't mean that nonfiction is necessarily an easier form, because it isn't. I think you have to consider the same things that you think about with fiction in terms of dialogue and structure and all those kinds of things. But when I write nonfiction, I feel like there's a certain structure to a piece that is already set out, even if it's very faint, because that structure is my own life. So usually when I deal with fiction, the hardest part of fiction for me is plot, figuring out what happens next. And there are often moments where I come up against writer's block and I just don't know what to do, where to go. And I never really found that problem with fiction or with nonfiction, because whenever I was unsure about something, especially with this book, if I was unsure about where to go next, I would just go and do some more research. And inevitably, the research would set me off down another rabbit hole of trying to figure something out or trying to discover something else. And that would then give me an idea where I could start writing about something else, or find a solution to a problem. So I guess that is sort of the interplay for me between personal experience and research, and how that sort of structure, a sort of very loose structure. It's kind of, I guess, maybe it's not. I'm not a poet, but I think sometimes for me it's like working in a sonnet form, where you have sort of a general idea, a general structure of what something's supposed to be and what it's supposed to look like, but you have a lot of freedom within that structure to do whatever you want. Whereas with fiction, I feel like I don't often have any sort of structure at all, and figuring that out is a whole other level of difficulty. Having said that, my next project coming out is a novel, followed by a collection of short stories. So maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment, because if I took my own advice, I would be working on something else nonfiction right now, and I'm not doing that. I don't quite know why. Edward says, do you have thoughts on the reinvented tales of writers like Angela Carter or Ludmilla? Oh, I can't pronounce her last name. I apologize. Does every generation do this? I have read some Angela Carter. I have not read Ludmilla, so I can only speak to one of them. I love Angela Carter. I do reference a number of her stories in Disfigured. I really like how she drew out, in particular, the sort of latent sexuality of fairy tales. I think you see this in fairy tales, the sort of older versions, stories that were told in the 16th, 17th centuries. I mean, in one version of Sleeping Beauty, which is called The Sun, Moon, and Talia, the king comes upon this girl who's sleeping in this castle, abandoned castle in the woods, and he rapes her while she's unconscious. And that is a very, very dark heart of the story that obviously is not touched upon, not explored in any way, shape, or form in the later Disney version, and thank goodness for that. But I really enjoyed the way that Angela Carter seized on things like that and brought out this really sort of sexual nature in fairy tales that was also very much tied to female empowerment. Stories like The Errol King or The Bloody Chamber. I was trying to remember the name of that, but The Bloody Chamber particularly bring out this sexual side of things and this sort of young female awakening in a way that I think even, Angela Carter is a fairly modern writer, but even for, 40 years ago when her work was being published, I think it was quite quite avant-garde at the time, and there's still things that we're uncovering now. I mean, fairy tales in general, I think, are so rich and are such a rich base from which to pull things out and discover things that there's just so much. They can continually be read anew and rediscovered. Let's see. And I guess maybe I'll take one more question. Okay, Caitlin McAuliffe says, my question is, what were some of the most problematic fairy tales you came across depicting disability? Ooh. So they're all bad. Yeah, they're pretty much all bad. Excuse me. The worst one, I think, was probably a fairy tale called The Cripple by Hans Christian Andersen. And it's a story of a young boy who is born, he can't walk, and he's sort of an invalid. And there's just a number of references throughout the tale to him being, useful in so much as a cripple can be useful, quote unquote. And at the end of the story, or toward the end of the story, there's this commotion in his house. He has a beloved bird that a friend gave him in a cage, and a cat comes through a window and goes after the bird. So the boy, in the way of miraculous happenings, suddenly manages to get strength and power in his legs back, and he jumps up from the couch and rescues the bird, and is no longer a cripple. And from that moment is then able to sort of go on and go out into the world and contribute to his family, contribute to his parents, and be useful in ways that he wasn't before. And that one, I think, was the worst. I think because there's just so much of an inherent understanding that the only way that a body and a person can be useful is if they are of use to somebody else. And there's no real inherent value in someone who is bedridden through virtue of disability. And I just think, we read stories like that now and we say, oh, well, that's kind of terrible. But then there's also people who might read that and say, well, it's a simplistic story, sure, but isn't it great that he got to walk again at the end of it? And I really would encourage people to think about that when we read fairy tales or we read disability stories that somehow have the eradication of disability at the end as a happy ending. Think about why people associate that with a happy ending. Why do people assume that the disabled life is somehow worth less or has less value than a life that is not disabled? Because that's not true, and we really need to start thinking about and pushing for a world that thinks of value in different ways and understands that people have intrinsic value and bring so many different wonderful things to the world, regardless of the shape or size or abilities of the bodies that they have. So I think I will end it there now. Thank you all so much for your wonderful questions. Sarah, thank you for putting the fishtail essay form as invented by Amanda Leduc, May 8th, 2020, in writing. Very much appreciate that. Again, thank you to Coach House Books. Thank you to the National Arts Centre, Facebook, Slate Music, SiriusXM, RBC, the Bennett Family Foundation for promoting and for supporting the Canada Performs program. If you haven't gotten a copy of Disfigured yet, you can get one today for 25% off. If you go to the Coach House Books website, there should be a link to purchase in the description for this video. And I will leave you guys with that. Thank you all so much for being here. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night and check out some other performances from Canada Performs and see what all of the wonderful artists across the country have to offer. Bye-bye. Have a great night, guys.